right, welcome to Fundamentals for Startups, CoMotion Labs production. My name is Ryan Buckmaster, and I lead the innovation investment team at CoMotion, and I'll be your host today. If you joined us before, you know that CoMotion Labs is a multi-industry incubator hosting early-stage startups from both inside and outside the UW community. We are committed to nurturing and enabling the success of our startups and contributing critical infrastructure and opportunities for learning, mentoring, and networking. And we do all this without taking any equity or IP. We have 3 incubators at 2 locations on campus, life sciences and hardware at Fluke Hall, and also here, the tech incubator at Startup Hall. If you are a founder and looking for a community to help your startup grow and flourish, and also be around a lot of really cool people, we'd love to talk to you. So Fundamentals for Startups is a regular lecture series open to anyone interested in learning about entrepreneurship or building a startup. Every week, we bring in experts with diverse perspectives and experiences to share insights, inspire action, and offer space for questions. So a couple announcements before we get going. One is that all the Fundamentals for Startups presentations are archived in YouTube and on the CoMotion website. You can filter by topic, so you want to know how to make your startup fail really fast or to avoid that, we got a video on that. Want to know how to do a great pitch? We got a video on that too. So to learn about and register for future fundamental events, visit CoMotion Labs online and subscribe to our YouTube channel. All right, now to the main event. Who likes money? All right, a few of you don't, that's okay, but for those who like money, you're at the right place. Today, I am very excited to introduce Richard Gersh, Executive Director at Life Science Washington. So Richard is a veteran venture capitalist and biotech executive who has helped companies secure over $100 million in federal funding and incentives, and has written over $25 million in successful SBIR and STTR grants. Today, Richard will help demystify the application process and empower you to go out and get some of this money for your startup success. All right, welcome, Richard.
Hey, good afternoon. I'm really glad to be here to chat a little bit this afternoon about SBIRs and STTRs and non-dilutive funding in general for startup companies. As Ryan mentioned, my background is in the several different spaces. I worked for a couple of different venture capital firms. The one that's really directly relevant to what we're talking about today on the non-dilutive funding side was a firm that I worked for in Manhattan, 21 Ventures. It was a renewable and green energy focused firm, and my job there was to help the companies address the stimulus package that was introduced by the Obama administration a very long time ago at this point. And in that role, helped the companies get about $110, $115 million in non-dilutive funding to help move projects forward. My career, absent that, has really been in the life science startup space. So renewable and green and life sciences, so that's sort of the high-tech background. On the startup space in the life sciences, I got my start in the regenerative medicine space and with a very small company that had a very small revenue stream, which is unusual with small life science companies. And we had really smart scientists that wanted to develop some new products. And when I was hanging out with a group of folks that got together, a bunch of other founders that would get together for lunch once a month, I was talking about some projects, and one of them mentioned SBIR grants. And he said, why don't you apply for one of those? And I thought there was absolutely no possible way that somebody would give a company money to go and develop a product to go and make more money on, because it just didn't make sense to me with my small business life science mindset. So I went back to my office, grabbed the postdoc that was working with us. I was the chief operating officer of the company, and she and I sat down, read a little bit about the program, wrote a phase 1 SBIR application to commercialize a primary human adipocyte cell system, and the first one ever introduced ultimately, so there's the spoiler alert. We were successful in getting the grant the first time out. Got $100,000. About 9 months later, we got another $1 million for a phase 2. And so I was hooked. I would have studied much harder in school on my writing and persuasive arguments had I known that 6 pages and then another 12 pages could get me $1.1 million in funding for my company. So about over the course of 7 years, we continued that process of writing SBIRs to develop additional products and introduce them into the catalog. During my tenure there, which lasted about 7 years, we got about $8 million in funding. We did a lot of partnerships with universities and applied for STTRs as well. So that's the sort of the sister mechanism to SBIR. So got SBIRs and STTRs in that role. Then went on to the venture capital firm in Manhattan as their director of grants and development, and got about $110 million from SBIRs and other non-dilutive funding that was out there, from tax and relocation incentives to Department of Energy grants and all kinds of other things. Went on to work for went to work for Rutgers as their chief science officer, helping spin out companies from the New Jersey Center for Biomaterials, and that was funded by a big Department of Defense grant. And part of the charge for that was commercializing some of the things that came out of it. Went on to West Virginia University, started the Innovation Center there and an accelerator program, launched about 18 companies and helped those companies, mentored them on how to go after non-dilutive federal funding. And in the 5 years that we were doing that, we launched the first 8 companies that were ever launched out of the health sciences at West Virginia University, and wound up with about $20 million in non-dilutive funding for them. Came to Washington about 5 years ago and have been working with Life Science Washington Institute, first as a strategic advisor, now as executive director. And one of the things that I did when I was there was, early on there, was wrote a grant to teach people how to write grants. And that's kind of why I'm here today. So that grant was a FAST grant, Federal and State Technology Partnership. We did that in partnership with the Washington Apex Accelerator, which is another organization that you should know about that helps small companies, tech-based and otherwise, get ready to apply for grants and other incentives from the government. And so I did that in partnership with them. And so part of my role here in the state is teaching people about different programs and how to think about them, how to strategize about them. As participants in this little seminar, what you're able to do after this, if you're interested, reach out to me. We can schedule one-on-ones. I do coaching and mentoring sessions around grant development, whether it be budget or specific aims, or thinking strategically how you can leverage university resources as a startup founder. And so sort of that whole across-the-board planning strategy. So I've done university licensing from the university end. And the other piece that I neglected to mention that is kind of important in all of this is I actually spun a company out of a university, a neurodiagnostics company. I've raised about $3.5 million for it. It's in clinical trials now at the University of Texas in Austin. So I've licensed technology as a university administrator. I've spun a company out and raised money, and I've gotten the non-dilutive funding piece of it too. And so I don't have all the answers by any stretch of the imagination, because nobody does, but I know where to go for answers. And I'm very happy to talk with any of you about projects you're working on and strategize around how to approach things. So there's a super long background on me just now, more than you needed to know, but I think it helps you understand the perspective I'm bringing to it and resources that I can bring to you as potential founders or founders. So what are we going to do today? We're going to talk a little bit about grants. Where do you get them? Who provides them? What do they pay for? And the big important question is, how do you find them? Then we're going to dig into a little bit deeper on SBIR and STTR grants, which is really the largest form of non-dilutive funding in the world. There's about $4 billion plus per year that the federal government has as a small business set aside for these programs. And it's specifically for small businesses. They all don't go to life science companies, unfortunately, but about $1 billion, $1.5 billion of it does. And they go in small chunks of money. They go in $200,000 to $300,000 for a phase 1, to a couple $1 million for a phase 2. So there's thousands of these that are awarded every year for technologies that are as broad as you can possibly imagine, as broad as science is, really. So let's see, we will jump to the next slide and pick up the pace a little bit. So grants, there's really two big categories, two big buckets that I think about when I think of businesses and granting programs, and that's sort of the Main Street business, mom and pops. So, pizza joints, pool supply, plumbing supply, plumbers, everything that would be very much of a Main Street business. And then there's STEM-based businesses, which are the ones that I know about and have been working with for most of my life. And so the STEM-based businesses are the ones that really the programs that I'm going to talk about are really directly applicable for. There's lots of resources out there from Main Street businesses, microloan funds, and other things that I could also chat with you about, but we aren't going to go down that rabbit hole today. So what are grants? Well, they aren't easy, and they take time, and they sound like free money. They aren't. They actually require work and accounting and all of the back office things that you need to have as a business anyway. The grants don't focus on your priorities, though they do address your priorities as a small business person. But what they are really doing, and this is important as you're thinking about how you write them, you're thinking about the funder. You're putting them first. What is the agency priority? Who are the people that they're trying to serve? And what goals are they trying to accomplish? And so it's like writing a cover letter for a resume. They're telling you what they need in that person. They're telling you what they need in the technology they want developed. And so you're going to talk about that, not what the grant can do for you or your company, but what you can do for that agency and the constituents that they're serving. Grants are focused, and then sometimes they aren't. So what I mean by that is National Institutes of Health, for example, 3 times a year issues a omnibus solicitation for grants. And they have 3 award dates for that omnibus solicitation. January 5th, April 5th, and September 5th. And it's the next business day after that if it doesn't happen to fall on a business day. And that's a very broad focus. And so if you're applying to National Institutes for General Medical Sciences, you can be pretty general, but you can also take a look at what they've awarded and identify appropriate avenues there. So there's sort of the broad announcements, and then there's some very focused ones. And the very focused ones are typically around contracting mechanisms as opposed to grants, but the 2 very broad funding agencies and funding announcements come from National Institutes of Health, and National Science Foundation also has a very broad web. Most of the others focus their funding requests, especially Department of Defense, very focused funding solicitations. So there's reporting that you have to do with these, and there are eligibility requirements. The eligibility requirements are pretty specific and broad, if that makes any sense. It might by the time we're done with this. All right, who makes the grants? There's lots of different places you can go to look for them. Here are some possibilities. The one that I like to highlight here, so federal, state, local, nonprofits, businesses, the grants can come from any number of places. The one that I always talk about when I do these is the Grammy Foundation, as in the Grammy Awards. So if you're doing interesting work or research that uses music to help address the human condition, the Grammy Foundation is interested in hearing about your program and possibly giving you $20,000. Nobody I've ever told this to has ever won a Grammy grant. I would love for one of you to win a Grammy grant so I could say one of the people that I've talked with has won a Grammy award. So if it's a close match, take a look at it. It's a light application. It's a few pages. But barring that, outside of the country, the Office of Chief Scientist in Israel is another place that offers really interesting and broadly focused grants. And so if you have any partnerships with Israeli institutions, another place to take a look. There's a multitude of other European organizations that are looking for technologies and partnerships and offer granting opportunities to US-based small businesses and large businesses alike, and universities, if that's still where you're thinking. All right, what do the grants pay for? You imagine it, they probably will, but most of them have really specific things that they're willing to pay for. So for as far as expenses go, there's generally divided into 2 big buckets: direct costs, things that are related to performing the work on the grant, and indirect costs, the things that you need to do to keep your business alive. With SBIR and STTR awards, there's another line that we all love to hear, and that's profit, and that's how much you get to tack on top of everything you just asked for profit, and you can use that money for anything you want. The prescribed spend for direct costs and indirect costs is very specific, and the program officers and the budgeting officers are very literal. And so as you're developing a budget, Make sure that you're asking to spend money for things that you are actually allowed to spend the money on. Because if you ask for things that you aren't allowed to spend money on and you build it into your budget and you get the award, the program officer or the budgeting officer is going to go through and say, you can't spend money on this. They'll tally up the number and they will deduct that from what they have awarded you. So you'll be in the uncomfortable situation of winning the award and feeling really successful and not having enough money to do the work that you said you want to do. And so knowing what agencies are willing to spend money on is essential. And so that really goes into thoroughly reading the solicitation and any appended documents that go along with that. Anybody that's written in an academic grant will be really familiar with that, or your sponsored programs office is really familiar with it, and they've course corrected as you've tried to ask for things you're not supposed to ask for. So how do you identify opportunities? There's a bunch of free sources out there. 2 of them are here. There's also fee-for-service resources. I almost never, and I would say it's been long enough that I never use the fee-for-service resources, at least on the pay versions. There's 3 versions on each of those that are listed. Grants.gov is great because what you're able to go in to do there is take a look at every grant opportunity that is available that the federal government has, whether it's for academics, whether it's for-profit, nonprofit, large, small business, and you're able to slice and dice that search very, very nicely. And so that's very, very effective. One of the other resources that's helpful in thinking about things you're going to apply for is the NIH Reporter website, and there's a list of resources on the last slide that you all will have access to. And that's grants that have been awarded. And so you can see what agencies have been interested in and what they've funded in the past. And so that's really helpful, especially over the previous couple of years, to think about where they may be interested in funding future projects. So that's a giant bunch of information about grants overall and some initial thoughts around how to think about budgeting. We'll dig into the SBIR and STTR program because that's probably the most likely source of grant funding for both startup companies that are just getting off the ground and later stage, as well as if you are running an academic lab or work in an academic lab. There's opportunities for academic labs and research institutions to participate in these as well in partnership with a small business. The program was started in 1982. It's something that has to be reauthorized periodically. It was most recently reauthorized maybe a year and a half ago. First awards were made in '83, and it was started, the STTR program, which is the sister program, and that has some other specific requirements to universities, was started, approved about 10 years later. So what do they look like? It's about $4.6 billion in money, so well over $4 billion, and this is on an annual basis. That the numbers here, 4.1 for the SBIR and 563 million for the STTR. Those are 2023 numbers, so about as recent as we can get on that. And there's small business set-asides, and so it's required by the federal agencies to make these pools of money available and set up programs to make these awards. The requirement there is if you're a federal agency and you spend more than $100 million on external research, you have to set aside 3.2% of that for small businesses, and that totals $4.1 billion. If you are doing over $1 billion in research, you have to set aside 0.45%, and that's $563 million. Why did they start these things? Well, they wanted to stimulate innovation, of course, right? It seems like a no-brainer now, but it was kind of innovative in 1982. They want to use small businesses to meet federal research and development needs and make that a part of the pathway. Part of the sort of the whole recognition that started 40-ish years ago that small businesses are the ones that create the most jobs and are really the foundation of a lot of what makes the economy move, and so they want to support that. They also have a preference for, it's not even a preference, they give special bonus points both for first-time investigators, but also for socially and economically disadvantaged entrepreneurs. And they think about that in a multitude of ways, but it can be race, ethnicity, it can be to an extent geography from rural areas versus urban. It can be lesser funded areas versus very, very well funded areas. The number of applications that are applied for and received, is as I mentioned in the multiple thousands, 7,000 per year nationally. But the sort of the disparity in awards now, the inequity in awards now, has dictated an emphasis on that. They want to increase the private sector commercialization and really push that. And that on all of these, it's all about the commercial potential. They don't want to fund basic science to any degree unless it is directly tied to a commercial outcome. And so they want to know what product you're going to develop, how it's going to change the lives of the constituents they serve. And so that's different from a lot of, maybe less so now, but certainly several years ago, many years ago, NIH and NSF were focused much more on answering fundamental scientific questions. And these are focused very much on taking those answers and turning them into products that change lives. And not just us, not just the people that are out there as entrepreneurs that are thinking about this as seed capital. The agencies think of it as seed capital too, and that's really important as a startup. You don't have to have a fancy lab. You don't have to have full-time employees. You don't have to have a lab at all. You don't have to have an office. I give you for instance, one of the faculty members that I worked with at West Virginia University was getting ready to retire, and he had a really interesting potential product for rheumatoid arthritis, a compound that he had developed. And he worked with him on a license, and he said, I'm going to apply for some funding and go after some angel investment. Well, he wasn't successful in the angel investment. I helped him with some grants. And he said, well, I don't have an office, so we used his home address, which was perfectly fine. And went after an award of a couple $1 million that was a direct to phase 2, which is a much higher bar to go after. Wasn't successful the first time, but he got scored, which is great because half the grants get scored and half get streamlined, which sounds nice, but it's not. Means you've been flushed. And so he was not streamlined, he was scored, he resubmitted, and he received the grant for 2 years for $2.2 million. It was the largest STTR, it was an STTR that had ever been received by a company in the state at that point. And it was a company without an office, without a lab, without full-time personnel. You don't have to put all of that in place or move to getting all of that in place until you receive the award. And so you can have good science and good stats that you're spinning out as a part of a company. And you don't have to be employing people. You have to do it after you get the money. Or after, maybe not after you get the money, after you get the notice of award. All of that has to be put into place. It's the promise of money. And so you can plan and you can apply for without actually hiring your first-time employee or quitting your job. All right, 11 agencies fund these things. Here are the 11. I'm not going to name them all because you are all able to read. There may be a 12th agency, and I went to sort of repopulate my slides, and I couldn't find the evidence of it. So it's not on here, but there might be a 12th agency. If there is, it's a teeny tiny amount of funding that they're offering anyway. So the ones that you're probably going to be most interested in are DHHS, department, where NIH is living, and National Science Foundation. Those are the two that are funding most life science technologies. Department of Energy is also a biggie for the state of Washington and for Washington-based companies and companies spinning out of UW. So smaller programs like U.S. Department of Agriculture has about $10 million in awards. NIH has about $1 billion in awards. So thinking about where you want to spend your time, that might be one thing to take into consideration. Agriculture is typically more focused. NIH is more broad, so fewer applications for agriculture, more for NIH. What do they fund? Again, related to agency priorities. How much have they funded? About 207,000 awards since 1983, and this I updated yesterday, or maybe 2 days ago. It might have been yesterday because I was late on getting my slides in. So they've funded a bunch of different awards since this program started. And the range of things that they fund is as broad as science, as I mentioned before. And here's a few examples that I pulled from their database of their awards database. If you're working on it and you are in the hard sciences, chances are they've funded something like it, or they would like to fund something like it at some point. It's a 3-phase program. Phase 1, so is a pool of applications, and that's really proof of concept. And from the rules, from the sort of the foundational level with this thing is that they say you don't have to have data. You have to have a really good theory and a good lit search that backs up your good theory, and it's something that we can all get behind in that hypothesis. But in the practice of all of this, you're never going to get an award without some data. And so don't believe any of the hype. If you're going to submit an application, you need to have something to put in it besides a really good theory and a good lit search. You need a good theory, a good lit search, and data to be competitive on a Phase 1 award. And so it's not nothing. NIH and NSF, National Science Foundation funding, is typically for a year. I put the range here on 3 to 24 months because some agencies, they'll have a shorter range and they'll allow for a longer period of time. But if you're looking at the sweet spot for this, it's 1 year. The top funding that's available from NIH now is $307,000 for that year. And that's all inclusive. And so that is your direct costs, and I'll talk about the budget in a few minutes, direct costs, indirect costs, and your profit. Whole number needs to be $307,000. There's some specific areas, depending on the agencies, where they have expanded budgetary authority. And what they do with that is National Cancer Institute is one that is a biggie for providing extra funds. And so they recognize the real expense of developing everything, really. But in particular areas, they say, okay, we give, we understand, and they allow for asking for reasonable costs. And so that means that your conversation with the program officer prior to submitting the application looks something like you're talking about what it is you're thinking about proposing, and you're asking if there's expanded budget authority. Can you ask for more than the maximum award amount? And if they say yes, do a dance and be happy, and then ask them, is there any guidance that they have? If the answer is no, then ask for $500,000 or $600,000. If the answer is yes, ask them how much you can ask for, and then ask for it. Because you'll never run out of thinking of ways to spend money on research on a program that you're developing for your company. And so always ask for the maximum award. That's a little spoiler alert for the budget discussion. And so Phase 2 is around the things that bullet point says. Efficacy, field testing, prototype development, all of those things that you want to do after you've finished your proof of concept. And Phase 3 is a really euphemism. The folks that are with the SBIR program on the Fed side don't like to hear me say this, but it's 90% of Phase 3 work is funded by the company. And so they say there's a 3-phase program, but really it's a 2-phase program with a good luck. And that's kind of Phase 3. In recent years, what they have done on Phase 3 is they've introduced a lot of other coaching and mentoring services, which is really helpful, and they're free, and they go to Phase 2 awardees. So take them up on that. And so they are what my little speech there on Phase 3 is a little stale at this point, if I'm being completely candid. So there are some opportunities with some agencies, but not all of them. So once you're in Phase 2, count on looking for opportunities, but yeah, you might be looking for investors instead of more federal help. All right. Differences, SBIR, STTR. STTR requires that your company partner with a nonprofit research institute. You have to. And the STTR usually focuses on technology commercialization of something that's been developed to that research institute. It doesn't have to, though. What a lot of people use an STTR for is if you are starting a company and you need to have access to smart people at that research institute, you might want to partner with them, even if the technology is not actually owned with them. Or if you need some of the core facilities the research institute has, because it would be way too expensive to buy them or get them inside your company for a really early stage. Another great reason to partner with a research institute. So it doesn't have, there's lots of reasons that people pursue that. One other is the STTR pot of money is specifically for STTR awards. It's a smaller pot of money, as you saw before. It's about 1/8-ish the size, but there are less than 1/8 the number of applications that are going after the STTR funding mechanism. So your likelihood in most instances, but not all, is higher if you pursue an STTR. The SBIR, the PI, principal investigator, has to be primarily employed at the small business. And so if you have a regular job that you want to keep after you keep the award, the SBIR is not going to be the mechanism for you. Like I said before, you don't have to quit your job when you put the application in for an SBIR. But once you receive that award, if you're the principal investigator, you do have to have more than 50% of your effort at your company, not at your current employer. STTR, the PI, can be primarily employed at either, except for the National Science Foundation. And that's one of the caveats with all of these programs, not just SBIR or STTR, but every federal and state and local grant. There's different requirements and different peculiarities with all of these things, and so reading the solicitation and the program rules is important. And understanding those, because just because you understand the National Science Foundation, STTR has to be at the small business. NIH, you don't have to be at the small business. You can be at the institute or the small business. So here's a couple of catches on the funding. The SBIR, 1/3, 33% of your research is allowed to be subcontracted to other entities. It doesn't have to be. You can keep all the money within the small business if you have all the expertise there and you don't need to subcontract anything out. STTR, you are required to subcontract 30%, a minimum of 30%, to a single nonprofit research institute. So it can't be 4 different universities that get 7.5% each. It has to be one that gets 30% of that research. And the way that they define research is pretty basic. It's money. And so however many dollars equates to percentages on your grant, that's how much those things are. You could try and make the case that research and money aren't the same thing, and somebody does research less expensively and blah, 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 and it'll fall on deaf ears, and they'll hear blah, blah, blah. So 30% on STTR has to go to the research institute. 40% has to go to your company. And then the other 30% can go wherever you want. You can go to the company, go to the research institute, you can go to other companies or other research institutes, whatever. So only for-profit small businesses can be the applicant. And so even if you're a faculty member or a postdoc or working at the university is not the applicant, your company. Your company is the applicant. Your company has to have fewer than 500 employees, which is a huge company in my perspective, but that's a small business in the United States. And so anybody that's under 500 can go after one of these things. All the work, here's one of the catches that a lot of people have had heartburn over, and there's, from my understanding, been some relaxation of this rule, but I think this is one of those things that needs to be confirmed on a case-by-case basis. Historically, all of the work on these awards has had to be done in the United States by companies that are more than 50% owned by U.S. citizens or permanent resident aliens. And so, give you on the last one, if your company is more than half owned by a venture capitalist, then I'm sorry, that's a tough place to be. But also on the federal side, there's other rules that come into play. And so if it is, we can have a separate conversation and go down that rabbit hole. But that's something to keep in mind if you're more than 50% owned by a venture capitalist. On the 50% requirement for U.S. citizens or permanent resident aliens ownership, if your company is, if you are from the UK and you own the company and you own 100% of the company, you're not eligible, despite the fact that your company may be in the United States. So it needs to be more than 50% U.S. citizen or permanent resident. If you receive an award and your company is, you are more than, it's more than 50% owned by U.S., met that requirement, the people that are working on that grant have to work on that grant on U.S. soil. And so you can have a company in Vancouver, Canada, help you on this, but they can't do the work in Canada. They have to do it in the United States. And this is where my understanding from a couple of folks that have been working with applicants said that there's been some agency relaxation of that particular rule depending on the country and depending on a couple of other things. And so that over the past couple of months when I've talked with folks, it's a question on a case by case with the program officer, with the agency you're applying for. But in general, plan for it not to be possible, but have the conversation if need be. Principal investigators. I am not going to dive deep onto what a PI is, but as PI, you're responsible. You are the designated fall person for if anything goes wrong or right. And usually wrong. Usually you're designated for that. If it goes right, somebody else will try and take credit. The PI has to be primarily employed by the small business for the SBIR. And again, 4 of the 5 federal agencies that award STTRs, so there's 5 agencies that award STTRs, say the PI can be on either side. National Science Foundation, it still has, the PI has to be on the small business. And on all federal agencies, there has to be a single principal investigator, except for NIH, who rightly recognizes the value and importance of team science, and you can have multi-PIs, just have to have a multi-PI management plan in place. We can talk about that if that's the case. So what do you have to do to apply for one of these things? It's a lot more involved than as a company or as a university applicant. There's a lot of registrations your company has to take care of. And so let's assume that you've done the hard work, you've got your company started, you have your employer identification number, you have your company banking, you have your registration with the state of Washington, whether you're incorporated here or you're licensed to do business here. All that's in place. Wonderful. Now there's a ton of things that you have to do for the feds to be in line to apply, and it takes time. It used to, many years ago, you could get it done in a week or 2, and now it can take months. And so if you think that you want to apply for a grant, taking care of registrations well ahead of time, even before you're planning the application, will alleviate a lot of stress and heartache and headache. Here's a little grid of registrations and agencies. And this sort of goes along with the story of just because you're registered to apply for one agency or understand the rules with one doesn't mean that the other you're in good shape with. Health and Human Services, NIH, of course, you need to register with these organizations. Department of Defense, some, and then an extra. NASA, some, then an extra. So it depends on the agency. Here's where the Apex Accelerator, which is funded by your tax dollars, is able to help you. And so there'll be a resource or link to a resource at the last slide here too. What that person is able to do, and her name is Kate. She's she is the sub-awardee for this application partner with us. What she's able to do is help you as a small business person identify all the places you're supposed to register and help you get registered there. It can be a bit of a thicket when you're trying to sort these things out. Each of these places gives you registration numbers and logins and tons of stuff. So imagine expanding your password and login list by this many, only it's related to your company. And if you screw it up, the databases that you've registered with won't talk to each other like they need to. And when you apply, your application won't go through if it's not all consistent with all of the registrations. Gave you a bit of an inspirational story with my faculty member at West Virginia University, and now I'm going to give you a horror story. So I was working with another faculty member at West Virginia University, and they had received lots of DARPA funding for some really just amazing stuff. And they had started a new company, which has now is successful and funded and all that. So she went through and registered her company. I said, do you want some help with this? I've got it. Okay. And then we went and submitted the application, passed all the checks, and then it bounced. Like, So we dig in and we try and fix it because she did her job and got it in a couple days early, so we had time to fix it. That's another thing, that submit your application early. So we go through and we try to fix it. Couldn't fix it. And the application didn't get accepted on that application route. And so there were many tiers, and she really encouraged me not to be so difficult about it. And we looked through it, and when she had completed the registrations, she used her home address, which is perfectly acceptable. And she lived at Westminster Drive, like Westminster Abbey. And on one of the registration systems, she had entered Westminster, or it had autocorrected to Westminster Drive. And it didn't work. And that was difficult. That was difficult. And so we fixed it, and she reapplied, and she got the money 4 months later, which is great. And the company is doing well, and it's been funded several times since then. But that 4 months sucked. That was not fun. So take the free help. Apex Accelerator. There'll be a link on the last slide. Take the help. So when you're putting the proposal together, and I should have done a quick survey of the room. Has anyone applied for any grants before on the academic side? R1s, R6, R21s, any? Yeah. And so when you're putting together applications, it's a small subset of the room, right? And so when you're putting together applications, grant applications, you take a look at the review criteria. You try to think through what are these people looking for. And when you get the reviews back and you're not successful, you're pretty sure, and I'm pretty sure too, because I've written my share, that the reviewers are morons and they haven't actually read your grant. But despite that fact, they still didn't make the award. And so on taking a look at the evaluation criteria and seeing how they talk about it in the solicitation, it's important. And so understanding how to talk about that and talking about that, and then calling out the evaluation criteria specifically in your technical proposal. Phase 1 application, $300,000. You have to write a 6-page technical proposal. So it's pretty tight and concise writing. And so as you're doing that and addressing specific evaluation criteria, one thing and one sort of text tool that I use when I'm doing is I call out the addressing of it very specifically, and in a way that might seem rudimentary, but as a reviewer, and I've reviewed plenty of innovation grants for NIH and others, I really appreciate it when applicants say things like, this project is innovative because, and then I can go, oh, here's where they tell me why they're innovative. Here's the innovation section. And I can read through it and decide if that's true or not, but I don't have to look for it, and I don't have to think about it, and I don't have to right? And I'm looking at 8 of these things, and there's hundreds of pages I have to look at, and you're making my life easier. And so understanding the evaluation criteria and calling it out and making the reviewer's life simpler is really paying yourself a great favor on that. You want to develop a preparation schedule, and back to the question of the registrations, taking care of those nice and early, and so you don't have to really take that into consideration. But these things, even though it's 6 pages and a 1-page specific aims, and of course all of the letters of support and your facilities description and your other components that come into this, it takes more time than you may anticipate if you've not written an application before. And so when you're developing that schedule, I usually start at the due date and work my way backwards, and start with a list of organizations and things that are out of my control. Right, so I can stay up and I can work for 40 hours straight if I have to, and nobody wants to be around me after that. But you can, right? You force yourself to work your way through a project because you only have you to answer to. But there's so many other people as the person that's responsible for pre-award work and submission and all of this that are completely not at your ability to flog to get to do what needs to be done. And so starting really early with that list of people and getting them queued up and putting a regular reminder in your calendar to remind them about what they owe you for this will help you get this done on time and a little bit less stressful. You need to allow a minimum of 10 weeks to do all of this work for a phase 1 application. You're not working 40 hours a week for 10 weeks. But other people and other variables come into play here that you simply can't control. What does a timeline look like? This is not the updated one, but okay. So I had one that was updated for September 2024 that would have given you real numbers here, but you can figure it out, right? So the weeks still translate. I started at the end here. So the next omnibus solicitation for NIH is due on the 5th of September. And a few days before that's due, you want to submit it, because if it's the first time you've done it, chances are pretty high that it's not going to be perfect. And it will either have things that are mistakes in it that it's still going to go through, or there might be something in there that is not going to let it go through, but simply because of an administrative error and you checked the wrong box. And you can go back and fix it. And if you have a few days to go through and sort it out, great. If you have 20 minutes before it's due at 5 o'clock Eastern time, it kind of is painful and nauseating. And we've got a couple minutes, so I'm going to jump onto the budget here for a few slides. So there's 2 big buckets: direct costs, indirect costs. Directly related to the work that is going on with the grant, regardless of if you have a company or not. You need 20% of your time. You need so many pipetters. You need access to a wind tunnel. You need, robotics. You need whatever. So things that are directly related to the work that's being done for your proof of concept. Then the indirect costs are all of the things that are related to running the business. For a phase 1 applicant, for a first-time applicant, first-time potential awardee, the NIH prescribes an indirect rate, and that's 40%. And so if you have $100,000 in indirect or direct costs, you'll have $40,000 in indirect costs that you're allowed to ask for. Always ask for that full 40%, because it costs far more to run a company than you possibly would be thinking about unless you've run a company before, and then you're going to wonder why the heck they're only letting you get 40%. Percentage effort for the principal investigator. This is something that is very important, because as a reviewer, I'm going to look at the scope of work that you've outlined in the technical proposal and ask myself, is the amount of time that they're asking for to perform this work, does it make sense? And if the answer is yes, and it's 20%, that's great. If you've asked for 20% and it's a 5% effort, I'm going to cut your budget. And so the other part here is make sure that you give a very robust budget justification. So we can certainly talk more about direct, indirect costs and rates, and happy to do that. But the straw man budget, straw person budget, straw budget, $200,000 award, always back out your profit first. That tells you how much is available for your directs and indirects total. Whatever the maximum is, the agency will let you ask for indirects. If you don't have a negotiated rate, ask for that, back that out. And now you know how much you have to spend to do the work, the actual work on the project. Always, always, always err on the side of giving too much information with a budget justification. That justification, if it is not robust or if it is vague or it seems like you're asking for duplicate costs, they will cut your budget and you will be in the uncomfortable situation of getting the award and being successful and not having enough money to do the work you've proposed. Understand and read the instruction and guidance. This is the place where you're going to find all the information about how to apply. The instructions are the overarching instructions for the application packet. The notice of funding opportunity, the NOFO, is going to be the part that is specific for the award you're applying for. That supersedes anything there's different in that from the SF424. NOFO takes priority. There's an informational webinar for each funding announcement. All they're doing is rereading that announcement to you, but it's helpful for me, so I go anyway. And then there's the program contact. And we're done 2 minutes late, but that's better than I usually do. So thank you. And happy to take questions now or afterwards or schedule follow-ups anytime anyone wants.
We have a few questions online. The first question is, what is the investor point of view for startups that got previous rounds of funding, IG Phase 1 and 2 from SBIR, NSF, NIH? Are investors different to this type of de-risk prior funding route?
Yeah, so my experience on as working for a couple of funds and working with people that have applied for funding and received it, investors are typically very excited about this additional other validation. They all do their business and scientific due diligence, but having a federal agency that's reviewed it and invested non-dilutive funding in there is generally viewed as a net positive. There's some investor groups that either are inexperienced with the program or it's usually inexperienced with the program. Sometimes have concerns about intellectual property and federal march-in rights, which is a completely different and longer conversation. But as it's generally viewed as a net positive and as a de-risking.
There's another question that says, how important the application to SBIR seed funding must have recent research papers published? What if we don't? How to prove the reviewer that the application is capable of delivering the product?
It's less about the published research papers and more about the preliminary data. And so being able to, basically, if you are doing a lab presentation of preliminary data that has been well vetted and from a well-designed experiment, that's perfectly fine. Research papers, of course, are great to include if they're your own. As you're doing your lit review and doing your technical proposal, making sure that you do a thorough lit review is really important, because the people that are reviewing these things, the men and women that are looking at this, they may have written the seminal paper on the exact topic that you're asking for funding for, and if you have excluded them and they are a reviewer, you're kind of not in good shape. So covering your bases on your lit review is really important.
You had mentioned a accelerator program. Can you repeat what that was again?
Yeah, so it's the Apex Accelerator, and it's the Washington Apex Accelerator. It changed its name recently from the Washington PTAC. It's not so much, it's not an accelerator program in the traditional sense. It's a program to accelerate businesses to federal funding. And they have, I don't know, 18, 20 people that work with them across the state, and they help small companies primarily with federal contracting, but they also help small businesses get all of their requirements and registrations in place to apply for federal grants too.
So for situations where you might have a PI that's employed by a university and they're applying for an SBIR, do you typically see them then quit their job, or go on leave once they receive the award, or do sometimes they have partners that act as PI as well? Like, what have you seen in that sense?
Yeah, it really is across the board. And so on a university entrepreneur that is going after funding, it can take, one shape that it often takes is a tenured faculty member works with their postdoc, and the postdoc takes the company side and works on it. PI, the tenured faculty member keeps her job or his job, and ownership and role in the company. Other ways have been faculty members have left the university and joined the company full-time after funding. Typically, they do that after their phase 2 because that's a couple $1 million and it's 2 years and gives you a little bit more security and runway. One thing you can do is you can apply for an STTR phase 1, where you're required to have that university 30% share and retain your faculty or other role at the university. And then on a phase 2, you can switch it to an SBIR and not have that university requirement any longer. And then sometimes faculty will make a jump then. Most of the time though, most of the time faculty are faculty because that's where they've spent their career, and they want to get a company started and they want to get technology commercialized out of their lab. And so it's usually a bit of a hybrid approach. And it's always a negotiation with a department chair, with your chair. And so I've seen dozens of different scenarios, and super happy to talk through any of them that you'd like to chat through at some point.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, Rich, there's quite an industry of consultants to help people with these sorts of grants. So any advice about using a consultant or anything to kind of watch out for?
Yeah. So I have a lot of opinions on grant consultants that I probably wouldn't put on the front page of the paper. I think that ultimately on this, consultants can be really valuable in a couple of ways. As a coach, as a mentor, but as somebody that you try and turn over the totality of your technical writing to, that's usually a mistake. I try to stay away from the always and never words because those are almost always never right. But usually it's a mistake. You are the scientific expert. You're the technical expert. And so understanding how to write those 6 pages and the specific aims page and doing it yourself is almost always more convincing to the reviewers.
Last question. Are nonprofits intended to provide a public service tool eligible for SBIR funding? Intending.
I don't know if I understand the question.
It says, are nonprofits intending to provide a public service tool eligible for SBIR funding? I'm assuming they're asking if nonprofits are eligible.
No, it's only for profit. So nonprofit could be a subaward, but the prime applicant has to be a for-profit small business.
All right, well, let's thank Rich one more time. All right, well, thank you for joining us today, and from everyone at CoMotion Labs, well, one more time, a big thank you to Rich for sharing all his knowledge. Also, next week, our series begins again on Friday, March 29th at noon. So Tia Over, Executive Vice President and Operations Officer at Spring Green Communications, present What's Your Story?, where she'll outline the information you need to gather and initial steps to compose a story that will sell. So sign up, and we'll see you in a few weeks. Also, not done yet, there is wonderful lunch outside, so please go get some food, mingle and network, and enjoy. Thank you so much.